My name is Whitney. I am 33 years old, and returning to attend my divorce hearing, I helped an elderly man on my flight who simply called himself a retired law teacher. He offered to accompany me to the courthouse. My husband laughed when he saw the elderly man beside me. Minutes later, the judge rose in panic. My husband's lawyer nearly collapsed, and Lance finally understood exactly whom he had mocked. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to completely destroy someone who underestimated your worth. We were cruising at 30,000 feet somewhere over the American Midwest. I rested my head against the cold plastic of the airplane window, utterly exhausted. I was flying back to Chicago after a grueling cross-country business trip that had drained every ounce of energy from my body. The steady hum of the jet engines usually lulled me to sleep, but my mind was racing too fast. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, deciding to connect to the in-flight wireless internet to clear out some emails before we landed. The moment my phone synchronized with the network, a notification chimed in my headset. It was a text message from my husband, Lance. We had been separated for exactly 3 weeks, right after he abruptly filed for divorce. I opened the message, expecting another argument about logistics. Instead, the words on the screen felt like a physical blow to my chest. He wrote, "I sold the summer cabin. The money is in an offshore account you cannot touch. Sign the $10,000 settlement at the mediation tomorrow, or my lawyers will make sure you leave this marriage with nothing. Do not bother fighting." I stared at the glowing screen as the cruelty of his message washed over me. The summer cabin had been our sanctuary, the only place where I felt truly at peace. He had liquidated it without my consent and hid the funds. $10,000 was a microscopic fraction of what we had built together, a deliberate insult meant to break my spirit. He expected me to cry and beg. He expected me to crumble right there in seat 14B. But Lance fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. I did not break down in tears. I closed my text messages and coldly opened my financial software. I am a top-tier corporate forensic auditor. My entire career is built on finding stolen money that wealthy people try very hard to hide. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I immediately began tracing the wire transfers associated with the cabin sale. I bypassed basic security protocols, accessing public property records and cross-referencing them with international banking codes. As I followed the digital paper trail, resentment fueled my focus. I had spent the last 10 years working 80-hour weeks to fund Lance's lifestyle and his ambitious tech startup. While he was busy networking at expensive lunches and pitching to investors, I was the one paying our mortgage, covering his business loans, and keeping us afloat. I sacrificed my own comfort, working late nights and weekends so he could pursue his dream. Last month, his tech company finally went public, resulting in a massive financial windfall. Instead of celebrating our shared success, he handed me divorce papers the very next day. He decided he no longer needed the hard-working wife who had financed his rise to the top. He wanted a clean slate and all the money for himself. My keystrokes grew harder as I tracked a suspicious transfer routing through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. He thought he was untraceable, but he left a digital footprint wide enough for a novice to follow, let alone a seasoned professional. I muttered my frustrations under my breath, mapping out his financial crimes in a secure spreadsheet. He was going to learn the hard way that you do not pick a financial fight with a forensic auditor. My intense concentration was abruptly broken by a sudden commotion to my right. The elderly man sitting next to me, who had been quietly reading a novel since takeoff, suddenly gasped. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, and his face turned an alarming shade of pale. He slumped forward, his heavy leather briefcase slipping from his lap and crashing to the floor. Hundreds of complex legal briefs and financial documents scattered across the narrow aisle. A few passengers glanced over with mild annoyance, but no one moved to help. I immediately slammed my laptop shut and sprang into action. "Are you all right?" I asked, leaning closer to him. He could barely speak, his skin cold and clammy. I recognized the symptoms of a hypoglycemic attack instantly. I pressed the flight attendant call button and flagged down a passing crew member. "He needs orange juice, right now," I instructed firmly. "Please hurry." The flight attendant rushed back with a cup of juice. I gently guided the cup to the elderly man's lips, encouraging him to take slow sips. Within a few minutes, the sugar began to take effect. The color slowly returned to his cheeks, and his trembling subsided. He let out a long, shaky breath and leaned back against the headrest. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice fragile but recovering. "I thought I had managed my blood sugar properly this morning." "I am just glad you are feeling better," I replied with a reassuring smile. "Please just rest for a moment while I take care of this mess." I unbuckled my seatbelt and knelt in the cramped aisle, gathering the avalanche of paperwork that had spilled from his briefcase. The documents were dense, filled with complex corporate tax jargon and intricate financial tables. As I began stacking the papers back into neat piles, my trained eye automatically scanned the columns of numbers. I could not help it. Auditing was practically wired into my DNA. While organizing a particularly thick quarterly tax assessment, my gaze caught a glaring mathematical error buried deep within a liability column. It was a subtle miscalculation regarding capital depreciation, but the cascading effect on the bottom line was massive. I carefully placed the stack of documents on his tray table. "Excuse me for prying," I said, gently tapping the specific page with my index finger. "But whoever prepared this corporate tax document made a significant error right here. They miscalculated the asset depreciation rate by a fraction of a percent. Over the course of the fiscal year, this oversight will cost the company roughly $4 million in unnecessary tax liabilities." The elderly man looked at the document, then looked up at me, his eyes sharpening with sudden, intense clarity. The fragility of his medical episode vanished entirely, replaced by a razor-sharp intellect. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and studied the numbers I had pointed out. A slow, appreciative smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I will be," he murmured, his tone filled with genuine respect. "You are absolutely right. I have had 3 senior partners review this file, and not a single one of them caught that discrepancy. You just saved me from a very embarrassing and costly multi-million-dollar oversight." I smiled warmly, glad I could help him in more ways than one. "It is what I do for a living," I explained, returning to my seat. "I am a forensic auditor. Numbers are much easier for me to read than people." He extended a steady hand toward me. "My name is Harrison. I am just a retired law teacher heading into the city to visit some old students." I shook his hand, feeling an unexpected sense of comfort in his calm, authoritative presence. "I am Whitney," I replied. "It is very nice to meet you, Harrison." The captain's voice echoed through the cabin, announcing our initial descent into Chicago. I began packing my laptop away, bracing myself for the miserable reality waiting for me on the ground. Just as the landing gear locked into place, my phone buzzed with another notification. This time it was a picture message from Brittany. Brittany was Lance's 23-year-old mistress, the woman he had abandoned our 10-year marriage for. I opened the message, my blood turning to absolute ice. The photograph showed Brittany's manicured hand resting on the steering wheel of a luxury car. But it was not the car that caught my immediate attention. Shining brightly on her ring finger was my late mother's heirloom diamond ring. The ring had gone missing from my jewelry box 3 days ago, and Lance had sworn he knew nothing about it. Below the devastating image was a caption that made my stomach churn with disgust. "Lance says this ring looks better on me. See you at the baggage claim, loser." Tires hit the tarmac, jolting me back into reality. I stared at the photograph of my late mother's ring on Brittany's hand. My mother had worn that ring every day. She had pressed it into my palm before she passed away, calling it a symbol of resilience. Lance knew what that ring meant to me. He had stolen a piece of my history. But the tears he expected did not come. Instead, an icy calm settled over my mind. I slipped my phone into my pocket and waited for the cabin doors to open. I thanked Harrison for his company. He gave a polite nod, adjusting his grip on his cane. I walked down the jet bridge with singular focus. My exhaustion evaporated, replaced by burning clarity. I followed the signs toward baggage claim, my flats clicking against the floor. I was walking onto a battlefield. The baggage claim area was crowded with tired travelers huddled around metal carousels. Brittany stood near the luggage belt, vibrating with anticipation. She wore a designer trench coat that I had paid for last Christmas. Lance claimed he needed funds for a corporate gift, but clearly the gift was for his mistress. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, and she held a manila envelope in her hands like it was a grand prize trophy. She spotted me approaching, and a smile stretched across her face. "Whitney!" she called out loudly. Her voice echoed over the mechanical hum, drawing the attention of several people nearby. She marched right up to me, making sure her voice carried to the onlookers. "I brought your divorce papers. Lance wanted to make sure you received them the very second you landed." She shoved the manila envelope against my chest. I did not lift my arms to take it, simply letting the packet drop heavily to the floor. Brittany scoffed, shaking her head as she looked me up and down with pity. "Honestly, Lance told me you let yourself go, but looking at you now, I completely understand why he left. You look like a tired office worker who buys clothes at a discount store. It is sad, really. But do not worry. If you sign those papers today," Lance said he might throw in a few extra $100 so you can buy something decent to wear to court. A woman nearby shot me a look of sympathy, while a businessman shook his head in disgust at Brittany's display. I did not flinch. I stepped closer to her, closing the distance between us, until she was forced to look directly into my eyes. I kept my voice quiet, completely composed, and utterly lethal. "You can tell my husband that I will not be signing his insulting settlement offer," I said calmly. "And while you are passing along messages, you might want to ask him for the receipt for that diamond ring you are currently wearing." Brittany lifted her hand, showing off the sparkling heirloom with a grin. "He did not buy it. It is a family piece. He said I deserve it because I am actually going to give him children." I smiled a tight, humorless expression that caused her grin to falter slightly. "Yes, it is a family piece," I agreed softly. "It belonged to my late mother. And I filed a police report for a stolen heirloom diamond ring exactly 3 days ago." Brittany's face drained of color. Her hand dropped to her side as if the ring had suddenly caught fire. The arrogant posture she had carried vanished, replaced by panic. I leaned in just a fraction closer, letting my words sink in. "I am sure you are aware that receiving stolen property is a serious crime." I continued in the same conversational tone. "But bringing stolen property across state lines elevates it to a federal offense. I am fairly certain the penalty involves significant prison time. Enjoy the ring, Brittany." She took a stumbling step backward, her hand instinctively covering the diamond on her finger. She looked around frantically, as if expecting federal agents to step out from behind the baggage carousel and arrest her. Before she could stammer out a defense, a massive shadow fell over us. Lance's private driver, a towering man named Greg, who had always intimidated me during our marriage, stepped aggressively into my personal space. He loomed over me, crossing his arms over his chest. "You need to back off right now, lady," Greg growled, using his sheer physical size to try and force me to retreat. "You are upsetting her, and Mr. Lance told me to make sure you do not cause any trouble today." I stood my ground, my heart racing, but my expression neutral. I was entirely alone, facing down a man twice my size and a woman wearing my mother's stolen jewelry. But before Greg could take another threatening step forward, a calm, commanding voice cut through the heavy tension. "That is quite enough." We all turned to see Harrison, the elderly man from my flight, standing just a few feet away. He was leaning heavily on his wooden cane, but there was absolutely nothing frail about his demeanor. He carried an aura of absolute authority, the kind of quiet power that commands immediate obedience without ever needing to shout. He stepped between Greg and me, fixing the massive driver with a piercing, unwavering stare that felt sharp enough to cut glass. "Step back from this young woman immediately," Harrison ordered. Greg hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the sheer force of Harrison's presence was undeniable. The driver lowered his arms and took 2 quick steps backward, muttering a quiet apology while breaking eye contact. He looked suddenly very small, intimidated by an elderly man with a cane. Harrison turned to me, his expression softening back into the kind, grandfatherly look he had shown on the airplane. "My private town car is waiting just outside at the curb, Whitney. Please allow me to offer you a ride to your hotel. You should not have to deal with this sort of unpleasantness after such a long flight." I looked at Brittany, who was still hyperventilating slightly, while staring at her hand and then at the scattered divorce papers lying ignored on the dirty airport floor. "Thank you, Harrison," I said gratefully. "I would appreciate that very much." We walked out the sliding glass doors into the cool Chicago air, leaving Brittany and the driver standing uselessly behind. The evening air felt refreshing against my flushed skin. A sleek black town car was idling at the curb, and a professional chauffeur immediately stepped out to open the rear door for us. As I settled into the luxurious leather seat, my phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. The caller identification showed Brittany's number, but when I answered, it was Lance's furious voice booming through the speaker. He did not bother with a greeting. "You think you are so smart, Whitney," he screamed, his rage echoing in the quiet space of the car. "You think you can threaten my girlfriend and just walk away? You are nothing but an auditor. I have retained Donovan Pierce to represent me. He is the most powerful attorney in the entire city, and Donovan golfs with the judge presiding over our case. You are dead in the water, Whitney." The town car pulled away from the airport, sealing us inside a cocoon of black leather and tinted glass. Lance's threat still echoed from my phone, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. I ended the call without answering and placed the device face down on my lap. Harrison watched me for a moment, his hands resting on the silver handle of his cane. "That sounded less like a husband and more like a man terrified of what you might discover," he said. "He is terrified," I replied. "He just does not know it yet." I opened my laptop and connected it to the secure hotspot I carried for corporate investigations. The screen filled with the encrypted spreadsheet I had been building for months. I had started the file after noticing small inconsistencies in our joint tax returns' unexplained transfers that Lance dismissed as startup expenses. At the time, I told myself I was being suspicious. Now, every irregular entry looked like a warning I had been trained to recognize but refused to accept. Harrison leaned closer as I enlarged the first page. "What exactly are we looking at?" "A shadow ledger," I explained. "It compares the financial records Lance disclosed during the divorce with the transactions that actually passed through our accounts. The left column is what he claims exists. The right column is what the banking network shows." I traced the route of the cabin proceeds across the screen. The money had entered our domestic account for less than 6 minutes before being split into 5 smaller transfers. Each payment moved through a different limited liability company, then converged in an account registered to an investment entity in the Cayman Islands. He structured the transfers to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, Harrison observed. Exactly. But he reused the same device authentication token for 3 shell companies. Different names, different banks, same digital fingerprint. He thought changing the labels would erase the connection. I opened another tab containing public corporate registrations, property records, and archived network logs from accounts I was authorized to access during our marriage. The same Internet Protocol address connected Lance's home office computer to a company called Northbridge Strategic Holdings. Northbridge had no employees, no office, and no legitimate revenue, yet it had received nearly $4 million during the month before Lance filed for divorce. Harrison's expression sharpened. Where did the money originate? That is the part I could not explain until tonight. I entered a series of search filters and compared the deposits against Preston Technologies' Public Securities and Exchange Commission filings. The numbers aligned too closely to be a coincidence. Payments described in the corporate ledger as shareholder distribution reserves had been redirected through Northbridge before reaching Lance's offshore account. My breath caught as the final reconciliation completed. A red discrepancy warning appeared across the screen. $2.5 million, I whispered. He siphoned it from the shareholder dividend account? Harrison studied the transaction chain. His calm made it easier for me to keep thinking instead of reacting. I opened the property database for the downtown condominium where Brittany had been living. The purchase agreement listed Northbridge Strategic Holdings as the funding source. Lance's name appeared as the authorized buyer. Then I reached the guarantor page. My own signature stared back at me. For several seconds, the city outside the windows disappeared. I enlarged the image until the forged strokes filled the screen. Whoever signed it had copied the shape of my handwriting, but missed the pressure pattern in the final letters. I knew that I had never touched that document. He used my name, I said. If the company is audited, the mortgage records make it look as though I approved the transfer and guaranteed the property. Harrison's voice remained quiet. That is not merely concealment. It is an attempt to construct a scapegoat. The realization landed harder than the divorce papers. Lance had not planned to discard me. He had designed a financial trail that placed me at the center of his fraud. If regulators discovered the missing shareholder funds, he could claim his forensic auditor wife had engineered the scheme without his knowledge. I copied the document into a protected evidence folder and generated a digital checksum to preserve its authenticity. My hands were steady, but anger burned beneath my ribs. He was going to let me take the fall, I said. 10 years of financing his company, and his final use for me was as insurance against prison. Do not let anger make you careless, Harrison warned gently. Facts are most powerful when they arrive in the correct order. He asked me to show him every source supporting it. I walked him through the cabin sale domestic transfers, shell registrations offshore, routing numbers, condominium deed, forged guarantor page, and corporate filings identifying the stolen funds. He listened like someone accustomed to finding a fatal weakness in mountains of paper. When I finished, he pointed to the transfers crossing state and national borders. This pattern reaches beyond family law. Concealed marital assets are serious, but forged bank documents and interstate electronic transfers create federal exposure. There is an obscure provision governing active financial fraud discovered in jointly accessible records. Donovan may try to argue that your evidence came from a protected commercial workspace. You need to preserve where each document came from and distinguish public records from files available through marital systems. I created a new column labeled Chain of Custody. Harrison dictated a precise structure: primary source, date acquired, method of access, authentication reference, related transaction. I entered each category. Print everything, he continued. Do not arrive with loose paper. Build a master binder with an index, numbered exhibits, and tabs for concealed marital assets, corporate embezzlement, forgery, and interstate transfers. Put the original source information behind each summary page. A dishonest lawyer can attack an accusation. It is much harder to attack an organized record. You sound like someone who spent more time in courtrooms than classrooms, I said. A smile touched his face. A good law teacher learns from courtrooms. I exported the shadow ledger, the supporting documents, and the checksum report into an encrypted archive. Then I sent Harrison a secure link with read-only access. I would appreciate another review, I told him. I will review it tonight, he replied. If your husband's attorney is as arrogant as he sounded, he will reveal his strategy before he realizes you have already defeated it. The town car turned into the downtown financial district. Glass towers rose around us, reflecting orange evening light. I looked at the forged signature on my screen. Lance believed freezing my accounts and hiring a connected lawyer would force me to surrender. He had no idea that his own records had already begun testifying against him. The driver stopped beneath the awning of my hotel. Harrison gave me one final instruction before I closed the laptop. Do not confront Lance with every fact at once. Let him believe he still controls the room. Arrogant men often confess when they think the truth cannot hurt them. I nodded and stepped onto the sidewalk with my suitcase and briefcase. The cold air sharpened my senses. I thanked Harrison and watched the town car disappear into traffic. For the first time, fear belonged at last to Lance, not to me. I walked through the revolving doors toward the marble reception desk, carrying evidence capable of dismantling my husband's empire. I stood at the polished marble counter of the downtown hotel lobby, staring at the electronic payment terminal. The screen flashed a bright red error message, indicating that my credit card had been declined. The front desk clerk, a young woman with a brass name tag that read Michelle, offered a sympathetic but uncomfortable smile. She tapped a few keys on her computer and gently informed me that the bank had placed a hard freeze on the joint account. Lance had moved faster than I anticipated. He had systematically shut down every financial lifeline we shared, effectively leaving me stranded in an upscale lobby with my luggage at my feet and absolutely nowhere to go. The humiliation he intended for me was clear. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to call him in tears, begging for access to my own money so I could afford a place to sleep. I could see the pity swimming in Michelle's eyes as she watched me process the situation. That look of pity did not break me. Instead, it fueled a burning, white-hot resolve deep in my chest. I reached into my wallet and bypassed my personal cards, my fingers closing around the cold plastic of my corporate expense account card. Using it for a personal hotel room was a massive, unprecedented professional risk. If my auditing firm found out, it could jeopardize my employment. But survival required calculated risks, and destroying Lance's smug superiority was now my only priority. I handed the corporate card to Michelle. She processed the payment, and this time, the terminal chimed with a successful approval. She handed me my room keys with a quiet wish for a better evening. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor, dragging my suitcase down the quiet, carpeted hallway. When I unlocked the door to my room, the heavy silence of the space wrapped around me. I did not bother turning on the television or unpacking my travel clothes. I walked straight to the large mahogany desk in the corner, plugged in my laptop, and connected my portable travel printer. The digital clock on the bedside table read 5 in the evening. I had exactly 14 hours until the mandatory pre-trial mediation at Donovan Pierce's law firm. 14 hours to dismantle the financial fortress my husband thought was impenetrable. I reopened the encrypted archive Harrison and I had organized in the town car. This time, I was not searching for the shape of the crime. I already knew exactly what Lance had done. My task now was to make every conclusion independently verifiable. I created a numbered exhibit list and separated the evidence into 4 sections: concealed marital assets, corporate embezzlement, forged documents, and interstate wire transfers. For each transaction, I attached the original source record, the date I obtained it, the lawful method of access, and the authentication data needed to establish a clean chain of custody. Public property filings went behind the condominium summary. Securities and Exchange Commission reports went behind the shareholder account analysis. The digital checksum for the forged guarantor agreement went beside enlarged comparisons of my authentic signature. I removed every unsupported assumption and replaced it with a documented date or a traceable routing number. I also prepared an executive summary identifying the amount stolen, the dates of each transfer, the accounts involved, and the false statements Lance had already submitted in his sworn financial affidavit. The summary cited the supporting exhibit beside every allegation, preventing Donovan from dismissing it as emotional speculation. Then, I downloaded certified copies of the cabin sale record and the corporate filings from their official databases. Those records did not depend on anything taken from Lance's home office. Even if Donovan attacked one source, 3 independent sources would still prove the same transfer. I printed 2 complete sets, one for the court and one to preserve outside my possession. At Harrison's suggestion, I added a 1-page map showing the movement of the stolen money. The diagram began with Preston Technologies' shareholder dividend reserve moved through Northbridge Strategic Holdings, split across domestic intermediary accounts, and ended in the Cayman Islands and Brittany's condominium. Anyone could understand the fraud within 30 seconds of looking at it. Before printing the final index, I uploaded the completed archive to the secure, read-only link I had shared with Harrison. I sent him a brief message confirming that every exhibit now carried a source reference and authentication note. That way, if my laptop disappeared or Lance tried to seize the binder, another protected copy would survive. The portable printer worked without pause, feeding page after page into the growing stacks across the bed. I punched holes, added numbered dividers, and checked every total twice. This was no longer a private spreadsheet created by an angry wife. It was a professional evidentiary record capable of surviving hostile scrutiny. The hours bled into one another. The massive city of Chicago went to sleep outside my hotel window, the streetlights reflecting off the glass, but I remained wide awake, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer magnitude of the betrayal I was uncovering. I drank 3 cups of black coffee from the hotel room maker, my eyes burning from staring at the glowing screen. Every new document I printed was another nail in my husband's coffin. I found receipts for expensive designer clothing, luxury vacations I was never invited on, and insurance correspondence proving that Lance had recently photographed and valued my mother's heirloom ring before it disappeared. He had built an entire parallel life using the financial stability I had provided by working myself to the bone. My brilliant mind, which had spent a decade ensuring his tech startup remained solvent and legally compliant, was now entirely focused on tearing his fraudulent empire down to its very foundations. By the time I snapped the heavy metal rings of the master binder shut, the sky outside my window was beginning to turn a pale, bruised shade of morning gray. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, my phone vibrated loudly against the wooden desk. I was already showered, dressed in my sharpest professional charcoal suit, and carefully packing my laptop into my leather briefcase. I picked up the phone. It was a voice memo from Lance. I tapped the screen to play the audio message, his smug, condescending tone filling the quiet hotel room. "I hope you slept well on the street," Whitney Lance said, letting out a cruel, dismissive laugh. "Or maybe you found a cheap motel that takes loose change." Listen to me very carefully right now. You are going to walk into that mediation room today and sign the settlement papers without a single word of complaint. If you do exactly as you are told, I might give you enough cash to rent a moving truck so you can get the rest of your cheap clothes out of my house. Do not test me today. I listened to the message twice, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, calculated resolve. He truly believed he had broken me. He believed his stolen money, his powerful lawyer, and his increasingly cruel tactics had successfully forced me into complete submission. I opened a new text message thread and typed my response with steady, unwavering fingers. "I balance books for a living, Lance. Yours are bleeding red. I hit send, grabbed the heavy color-coded master binder from the desk, and walked out the door, fully prepared for war. Walking through the steel double doors of Donovan Pierce's downtown law firm felt like stepping into a lion's den. The receptionist simply pointed a rigid finger toward a hallway lined with frosted glass walls. I carried my master binder tightly against my chest, feeling the satisfying weight of the evidence inside it. I was directed into a corner conference room. In the center sat a mahogany table that looked more like an execution block than a place for fair mediation. Lance was already sitting there, leaning back in a plush leather chair. He wore a custom-tailored suit that I had personally paid for last spring. Next to him sat his attorney, Donovan Pierce. Donovan was a shark of a man, with slicked-back hair and a predatory smile. They both exuded arrogant confidence as I walked through the door. "You actually showed up," Donovan said, sounding amused as I took the empty seat across from them. I placed my briefcase on the floor, but kept the heavy binder resting on my lap, out of their line of sight. "I told you I would be here," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. Lance let out a mocking laugh. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the polished wood. "I got your text message this morning, Whitney. You always did have a flair for the dramatic. But we are not here to play your silly games today. We are here to finalize the end of this mistake of a marriage so I can get back to running my successful company." Donovan reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thin stack of freshly printed legal documents. He slid the papers across the smooth surface of the mahogany table with a quick flick of his wrist, stopping them exactly in front of me. Sitting right on top of the stack was a check made out to my name for exactly $10,000. "This is the final settlement agreement," Donovan stated, his voice dripping with condescension. "My client is offering you a generous $10,000 to walk away quietly without making a scene. It is more than enough to cover a deposit on a modest apartment and buy yourself some new clothes for job interviews." I looked down at the insulting check and then back up at the high-powered attorney. $10,000 does not even cover the initial seed money I personally invested into Lance's startup 5 years ago, I pointed out calmly. "It certainly does not account for the equity I am legally entitled to now that his tech company has finally gone public." Donovan chuckled, leaning back in his expensive chair. "You seem to fundamentally misunderstand how this legal process works, Whitney. This is not a friendly negotiation where we compromise. You are sitting in my office without legal representation, demanding corporate equity you will never see. The presiding judge assigned to your divorce case is Honorable Judge Thomas Miller. Do you happen to know Judge Miller?" I shook my head, maintaining my stoic expression, despite the rising tension. "Well, I certainly do," Donovan said, a smug, satisfied smile spreading broadly across his face. "Judge Miller and I play golf together at the exclusive country club every single Sunday morning. Our families have vacationed together in the Bahamas. He is a very practical man who absolutely despises when unrepresented spouses waste the court's valuable time with frivolous financial demands. If you force us to go to the official hearing tomorrow, Judge Miller will take one quick look at my recommendation and he will finalize the divorce exactly as I have drafted it here today. Only if we go to court tomorrow, my client will withdraw this generous $10,000 offer entirely. You will leave the courthouse with absolutely nothing, and I will petition the judge to make you pay for all of my expensive legal fees." Lance smiled broadly, looking incredibly pleased with his expensive attack dog. "You have exactly 5 minutes to sign those papers and take the check. After that, the offer expires, and you can explain to the judge why you are wasting his busy schedule." I let the heavy silence stretch across the cold room for a full, agonizing minute. I watched them bask in their perceived victory, thinking they had won the battle. I reached out slowly and placed my fingertips gently on the edge of the settlement papers. Donovan immediately produced an expensive silver pen from his jacket pocket and set it down confidently next to the documents. But instead of picking up the silver pen, I coldly pushed the entire stack of settlement papers back across the mahogany table. The papers slid swiftly toward Donovan, stopping just short of spilling off the edge and into his lap. "I will not be signing your ridiculous settlement today," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper. "Or tomorrow, or ever." Lance slammed his fist hard onto the table, his face flushing with sudden, uncontrollable anger. "You stupid, stubborn woman," he snarled, leaning aggressively toward me. "You are going to completely ruin yourself over nothing." I lifted the massive color-coded master binder from my lap and dropped it squarely onto the glass center of the mahogany table. The loud, heavy thud echoed sharply, like a gunshot through the quiet conference room. Donovan blinked rapidly in surprise, while Lance stared at the thick binder with a confusing mixture of shock and growing unease. I slowly reached out and opened the heavy binder to page 1, flipping the cover back to reveal the meticulous financial documentation I had spent all night compiling. I turned the binder around so the pages faced them directly across the table. "You see, Donovan?" I began, leaning forward slightly to command the space. "I am not just an unrepresented spouse making frivolous demands. I am a top-tier corporate forensic auditor who finds hidden money for a living." And while Lance truly thought he was being clever by hiding marital assets in offshore accounts, he made the fatal mistake of leaving a digital trail that a first-year accounting student could easily follow. I tapped the top sheet of paper, highlighting a specific row of printed numbers. "This is the exact routing number for a specific shell company located in the Cayman Islands, a shell company that Lance secretly established exactly 3 weeks before he filed for this divorce." Lance's smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. I flipped to the next page, revealing a series of bright yellow highlighted documents. "According to these authenticated bank records, you did not use our marital savings to buy that expensive condo, Lance. You actively embezzled $2.5 million directly from your own company, shareholder dividend accounts, to pay for it. And to make matters infinitely worse, you deliberately forged my signature as the primary financial guarantor on those condo mortgage documents. You committed federal wire fraud." Lance began to sweat profusely. Just as I was about to explain his impending prison sentence, the heavy wooden doors of the conference room flew open. Barbara Lance's wealthy and vicious mother stormed in with 2 security guards pointing a finger directly at my face. "You ungrateful, barren gold digger!" Barbara screamed. "You sign those papers right now, or I am making a phone call to your chief executive officer." Her voice was shrill and piercing, echoing off the frosted glass walls of the conference room. Barbara marched forward, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She stopped just inches from my chair, glaring down at me with absolute contempt. She was a woman who had spent her entire life using her inherited wealth as a weapon to control everyone around her, and she clearly viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle in her son's path to greatness. "You really thought you could come in here and blackmail my son?" she spat, her face turning a mottled shade of crimson. "You think this little scrapbook of yours means anything to us? You are nothing, Whitney. You have always been nothing. 10 years of marriage and you could not even give him a single child. You are barren and useless, so do not you dare sit there and act surprised that Lance had to look elsewhere to find a real woman. He needed someone who could actually build a family and give me a grandchild. You drove him into Brittany's arms because you were too busy playing corporate accountant to be a proper wife." The sheer cruelty of her words hung heavily in the cold air of the room. She knew exactly how painful our struggles with infertility had been. She knew about the invasive treatments, the heartbreaking negative tests, and the tears I had shed in private. Using that pain as a weapon to justify her son's infidelity was a level of viciousness that temporarily stole the breath from my lungs. But I refused to let her see me bleed. I kept my posture perfectly straight, staring back at her, without a single ounce of submission. When she saw that her personal attacks were not making me crumble, Barbara pulled her sleek silver smartphone from her designer handbag and held it up like a loaded weapon. "If you do not pick up that silver pen and sign those settlement papers right this very second, I am calling the managing partner at your auditing firm," she threatened, her thumb hovering menacingly over the screen. "I will tell him that you used your corporate access to illegally steal sensitive client data. I will tell him you are conducting unauthorized financial espionage on innocent companies to settle a personal vendetta. Do you know what happens to a corporate forensic auditor when a prominent socialite accuses them of data theft? Your firm will fire you before lunch. The state board will permanently revoke your professional license. You will never work in the financial sector again. You will be entirely destitute." Lance smiled, leaning back in his leather chair as he watched his mother do his dirty work. He looked incredibly satisfied, perfectly content to hide behind her wealth and social influence. But as Barbara stood there, panting with self-righteous fury, Donovan Pierce held up a perfectly manicured hand. "Now, Barbara, let us not get ahead of ourselves," the high-powered attorney said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. "There is absolutely no need to bother the state licensing board today. Please sit down." Barbara huffed, but slowly lowered her phone, taking the empty chair next to Lance. She crossed her arms tightly, glaring at me like I was an insect that needed to be crushed. Donovan adjusted his suit jacket and leaned over the mahogany table, resting his forearms near my master binder. He looked at the meticulously organized pages of financial evidence, and then he let out a soft, chilling chuckle. "I have to admit, Whitney, you did an impressive amount of homework," Donovan said, shaking his head with mock admiration. "The routing numbers, the offshore shell companies, the shareholder dividend tracing, it is all very thorough. If we were sitting in a federal regulatory hearing right now, my client might actually have a slight problem. But we are not in a federal hearing. We are sitting in a family law mediation, and tomorrow morning we will be standing in a state divorce court." He reached out and casually flipped the cover of my binder shut, covering the damning evidence with a heavy slap of cardboard. He leaned closer to me, lowering his voice into a predatory whisper. "You made one massive, critical error in your brilliant little audit, Whitney. You obtained these specific bank records and corporate tax filings by accessing Lance's private home office network. You searched through his personal computer files and his physical desk drawers to compile this data. Did you secure a legal subpoena from a judge before you conducted this little investigation?" I stared at him, maintaining my composure, but a cold knot of dread began to form tightly in my stomach. "I did not need a subpoena," I replied evenly. "Those documents were located inside our marital home. We share that property." Donovan smiled, a wide, terrifying grin that exposed his perfect white teeth. "That is where you are completely wrong," he corrected smoothly. "The house is a marital asset, yes, but Lance's home office was established exclusively for his corporate business. It is legally protected as a private commercial workspace. By breaking into his encrypted files without a formal court-ordered subpoena, you conducted an illegal search. Under the law, every single piece of evidence you just printed in this colorful binder is considered fruit of the poisonous tree." He tapped his silver pen against the cover of the binder, emphasizing his victory. "It is entirely inadmissible in court. You cannot submit stolen documents to prove financial fraud in a civil divorce proceeding. The moment you try to introduce this binder tomorrow morning, I will file an immediate motion to suppress it based on a violation of my client's privacy rights. And because Judge Miller and I understand each other perfectly, he will grant my motion without a second thought." Lance let out a loud, victorious laugh. "You really thought you had me figured out," he mocked, his arrogance returning in full force. You are just a number cruncher, Whitney. You do not know how the real world works. You do not know how power works. Donovan leaned even closer, delivering his final, crushing ultimatum. Tomorrow morning, the judge will throw your little binder in the trash, and I will hit you with a defamation suit that will leave you in debt for the rest of your natural life. I will personally ensure that you pay every single penny of my legal fees. You will be bankrupt, homeless, and completely destroyed. So I strongly suggest you take the $10,000 check right now and walk away while I am still feeling generous. The air in the room felt impossibly thin. The realization of what Donovan was saying crashed down on me with suffocating weight. The legal system was not designed to protect the truth. It was designed to protect the people who could afford to manipulate the rules. Lance had stolen millions of dollars, forged my signature, and committed federal fraud. But because I did not have a judge's permission to find the proof the court was going to look the other way, I stood up, pushing my chair back, and walked out of the firm, feeling the crushing weight of the rigged legal system. My phone lit up with a text from Harrison. I reviewed the digital copies you sent me. Meet me at the courthouse cafe at 7 tomorrow morning. I found the crack in his armor. The morning air was biting as I walked toward the courthouse district. I had barely slept at all last night. Harrison's message was a lifeline. I pushed open the glass door of the corner cafe just before 7. Harrison sat in a quiet booth, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. He belonged to an era where honor mattered more than cheap tricks. He slid a cup of tea toward me as I explained everything from yesterday. Barbara had threatened my license, and Donovan laid a legal trap on, claiming my audit was inadmissible because I gathered documents without a subpoena. Harrison listened, absorbing the details. When I finished, he gave a soft, knowing nod. Donovan relies on a predictable defense strategy, Harrison explained. He is arguing the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. He wants the judge to believe that by breaching your husband's expectation of privacy in a commercial workspace, your evidence is legally tainted and suppressed. My entire stomach tightened painfully. Donovan plays golf with the judge, so he knows his motion will be granted, I added bitterly. I have absolute proof of Lance's embezzlement, but the system is rigged. Harrison smiled. A rigged system only works when players follow corrupt rules, Harrison said. Donovan's perspective is confined to state-level family law. He plays checkers, Whitney. We are playing federal chess. Harrison reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a single piece of paper. He pushed it across the table. It was a legal brief, highlighting a precedent-setting ruling from a federal appellate court. Read the highlighted section Harrison instructed. I scanned the dense legal text. According to the federal ruling, the expectation of marital privacy in a home office is completely nullified when the space is actively used to commit federal tax evasion and wire fraud against corporate shareholders. Because Lance used those specific files to illegally siphon dividend funds across state lines to purchase real estate, the space lost all civil privacy protections. My discovery was not an illegal search, but the exposure of an active federal crime. This obliterates Donovan's entire defense strategy, I realized. It is the perfect silver bullet. Exactly, Harrison confirmed. When Donovan stands up today and pompously moves to dismiss your evidence based on a privacy violation, you will let him finish his entire speech. Let him put his arrogant argument on the official court record. Then, you will present this federal precedent. It legally forces the judge to admit your entire binder into evidence. If the judge refuses and attempts to favor Donovan, he will be committing a verifiable ethics violation on the record, something no judge will risk when faced with federal precedent. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline rush through my veins. The crushing weight that had been suffocating me lifted entirely. I folded the precious document and tucked it safely inside my briefcase next to my master binder. I had the weapon I needed. I just had to wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. As we finished our drinks and prepared to leave the cafe, My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out to check the screen. It was a notification from a social media application. I had blocked Lance and Brittany on everything, but my best friend, Vanessa, had sent me a screen recording of a live video Brittany was currently broadcasting. I tapped the video to play it, keeping the volume low. Brittany was standing in the middle of a brightly lit, high-end luxury car dealership. She was twirling around, pointing the camera at a gleaming, brand-new white Porsche sitting on the showroom floor. Lance was standing in the background, talking to a salesman and signing a stack of dealership paperwork. "Can you guys even believe?" this Brittany squealed to her audience, her voice dripping with extreme entitlement. "Lance is buying me my dream car today. He told me he has all this newly freed up cash, just sitting around, waiting to be spent now that he is finally getting rid of his useless, dead weight of a wife. I am so blessed." She held her hand up to the camera, deliberately flashing my late mother's stolen heirloom diamond ring for all her viewers to see. I stared at the video, feeling a cold, dark wave of absolute disgust wash over me. The massive, newly freed-up cash Lance was using to buy his mistress a luxury sports car was the exact same money he had illegally embezzled from his corporate shareholders. He was standing in a dealership, spending stolen funds on camera, mere minutes before he was scheduled to appear in a courtroom and swear under penalty of perjury that he was virtually broke. I turned the screen around and showed the live video to Harrison. He watched the broadcast for a few seconds, his expression hardening into a look of profound distaste. "The arrogance of modern criminals is truly astounding," Harrison noted quietly. "They document their own downfall for the entire world to see." "Save that video, Whitney. We will make sure the judge gets a very clear look at how your husband chooses to spend his mornings." I saved the live recording to my secure drive, sliding my phone back into my pocket. I grabbed my briefcase, and Harrison took his wooden cane. We walked out of the cafe together, stepping into the crisp morning air. The imposing structure of the county courthouse loomed just a block away. Its tall stone pillars and wide concrete steps were designed to make people feel small and intimidated. But as I walked toward the building, I felt taller than I had in years. I was walking into battle with an absolute master of the law by my side, and I was armed with the truth. We approached the heavy mahogany double doors of the designated family court hallway. The corridor was wide and echoing, lined with wooden benches and nervous couples waiting for their hearings. But my attention was immediately drawn to a loud, obnoxious burst of laughter echoing from down the hall. Lance, Brittany, Barbara, and Donovan Pierce were all standing together in a tight circle outside the courtroom doors. They looked like they were attending a cocktail party rather than a serious legal proceeding. Barbara was wearing a ridiculous fur coat, holding a designer handbag and chuckling at something Donovan had just said. Brittany was leaning against Lance, whispering in his ear and giggling, probably still thrilled about her new car. Lance stood tall, his chest puffed out, radiating the obnoxious confidence of a man who believed the entire world belonged to him. As Harrison and I walked down the corridor, the steady, rhythmic tapping of Harrison's wooden cane against the marble floor drew their attention. Lance turned his head, his eyes locking onto me. He looked at my professional charcoal suit, my sensible shoes, and my tightly gripped leather briefcase. Then his gaze shifted to the elderly man walking slowly beside me. A wide, incredibly cruel smile spread across Lance's face. He let out a loud, barking laugh that echoed down the hallway, making sure everyone waiting nearby could hear him. "What exactly is this?" Whitney Lance shouted, pointing a mocking finger in our direction. "You realized you could not afford a real lawyer to defend you today? So you went down to the local retirement home and brought an escapee to come in here and beg for mercy on your behalf?" The sheer volume of his cruel laughter bounced off the marble walls, drawing eyes. Brittany giggled, while Barbara let out a sharp snort. Donovan smirked, looking at Harrison with dismissal. They stood there, a pack of wolves convinced they had won before we stepped inside. I did not break my stride. I felt a flash of anger, but, glancing at the elderly man beside me, I saw he was completely unfazed. Harrison simply adjusted his grip on his wooden cane and offered a reassuring smile. It was the patient smile of a hunter watching his prey walk into a trap. We pulled open the doors of courtroom 4. The dark oak walls absorbed light, and the towering bench dominated the room. I walked down the center aisle and took my seat at the petitioner's table, alone. Harrison took a seat in the front row of the public gallery, directly behind the wooden partition separating spectators from the legal proceedings. He rested his hands on his cane, waiting with the stillness of a statue. A moment later, the heavy doors swung open. Lance and his entourage strutted into the courtroom. Brittany and Barbara took seats in the gallery, just feet away from Harrison. Lance and Donovan took their places at the respondents' table, next to mine. Lance leaned back, stretching his legs and projecting untouchable arrogance. He did not even look at me, too busy scrolling through his phone, checking on Brittany's sports car. The bailiff instructed everyone to rise. The Honorable Judge Thomas Miller strode into the courtroom, a stern-looking man with an expression of perpetual annoyance. He took his seat at the elevated bench, signaling we could sit down. I watched the subtle communication pass between him and Donovan. Donovan offered a slight nod, and Judge Miller returned it. The fix was entirely in, and the judge was clearly ready to rubber stamp my ruin. "Let us get this over with," Judge Miller grumbled, looking down at his docket. "We are here for the final settlement hearing between Whitney and Lance. The respondent is represented by Mr. Donovan Pierce." He glanced at my table, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "The petitioner has chosen to represent herself today. That is highly ill-advised, young lady. I expect this to be brief and efficient." Donovan immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He stepped out from behind his table, exuding the confidence of a man holding the room in his palm. "Thank you, Your Honor," Donovan began, his voice projecting clearly. "We have drafted a comprehensive final settlement agreement, offering the petitioner a lump sum of $10,000 to finalize this dissolution today. However, the petitioner has threatened to introduce a binder of financial evidence that she illegally compiled by breaching my client's protected commercial workspace." "Your Honor, the petitioner conducted an unauthorized search of my client's private home office," Donovan continued, turning sharp. "She stole sensitive corporate documents without a subpoena. Under the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine, her audit is legally tainted, violating privacy rights. Therefore, I officially move to dismiss all financial claims, permanently suppress her binder, and immediately enforce the settlement." Judge Miller nodded, looking entirely convinced by Donovan's rehearsed speech. He did not ask to see my evidence. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "That seems like a very straightforward motion, Mr. Pierce," Judge Miller stated, adjusting his reading glasses. "The court takes privacy violations very seriously. Ms. Whitney, unless you have a compelling legal argument as to why I should not grant this motion right now, I strongly suggest you sign the settlement agreement your husband provided. If you refuse, I will dismiss your claims with prejudice and order you to pay Mr. Pierce Judge legal fees." Lance turned to look at me, a massive, triumphant grin spreading across his face. In the gallery, I heard Barbara let out a sharp, victorious laugh. They thought the trap had snapped shut. I stood up, slowly picking up my heavy master binder. "Your Honor, I respectfully refuse to sign that settlement," I said, my voice carrying clearly. "And as for my legal argument against the motion to suppress, I would like to yield the floor to my advisor." Judge Miller frowned deeply, his face flushing with irritation. "Advisor," he barked, slamming his hand against his desk. "What advisor? You are listed as a pro se litigant. You do not have an attorney on record, and I will not allow some uncredentialed friend or family member to come up here and waste this court's valuable time playing lawyer." Before the judge could issue another threat, the low, rhythmic tapping of a wooden cane echoed through the quiet courtroom. From the front row of the public gallery, Harrison stood up. He moved with slow, deliberate grace, opening the small swinging gate of the wooden partition that separated the spectators from the legal floor. He stepped past the barrier, walking directly into the center of the courtroom well, coming to stand right beside my table. The transformation in Judge Miller was instantaneous and absolutely terrifying to witness. The moment the judge looked down from his elevated bench and saw the elderly man standing beside me, the irritated, dismissive scowl vanished from his face. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The blood completely drained from the judge's cheeks, leaving him a ghastly, sickly shade of pale gray. The pen he had been holding slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the wood of his desk. Judge Miller immediately stood up. His hands were visibly trembling as he braced them against the top of the bench. He looked as though he had just seen a ghost walk through the solid oak doors. Justice Caldwell, Judge Miller stammered, his voice cracking with profound reverence and absolute terror. "I had no idea you were in the building. It is a profound honor to have you in my courtroom, sir." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. At the respondents' table, Donovan Pierce froze. He turned his head slowly, looking at the elderly man standing beside me. I watched the realization hit the high-powered attorney like a physical blow to the stomach. Donovan's knees literally buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of his table just to keep himself standing upright. The arrogant swagger evaporated, leaving a man who looked like he was about to be executed. Lance, utterly confused by his lawyer's sudden physical collapse and the judge's terrified reaction, looked back and forth between them. "What is going on?" Lance hissed quietly at Donovan. "Who is this guy?" Donovan could barely speak, staring at Harrison with terrified eyes. Harrison Caldwell was not just a retired teacher. He was a legendary former federal appellate judge. More importantly, Justice Caldwell was the sitting chairman of the State Bar Ethics and Disciplinary Committee, with absolute power to permanently strip any corrupt judge of their license. He literally wrote the textbook Donovan studied in law school. And now, he was standing directly on the opposing side of the courtroom floor. Donovan knew exactly what this meant. He realized that every single underhanded trick he had pulled, the intimidation tactics, the threat of a defamation suit, and the backroom deals with Judge Miller were about to be systematically dismantled. His entire legal career flashed before his eyes, in total ruin. The suffocating tension in the courtroom was suddenly shattered by Harrison clearing his throat. The sound was incredibly soft, yet it carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority across the heavy silence. He took a measured, deliberate step forward, leaning slightly on his polished wooden cane. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, I would like to formally request permission to act as legal advisor pro hoc vice for the petitioner, Ms. Whitney, today," Harrison stated. His voice was rich and steady, echoing flawlessly off the dark oak walls. Judge Miller practically tripped over his own dark judicial robes in his frantic haste to accommodate the request. The usually terrifying judge leaned so far forward over the heavy oak bench that he nearly knocked over his microphone stand. "Yes, of course, Justice Caldwell," the judge sputtered out, his voice completely stripped of the arrogant, commanding bark he had wielded just moments ago. "It would be an absolute privilege to grant that request. The court formally recognizes you as the petitioner's advisor without hesitation. Please let the official record reflect this update immediately." The blatant display of obsequious groveling from the bench was almost comical to witness. Judge Miller was sweating visibly under the bright fluorescent lights, his eyes darting nervously between Harrison and the court reporter, making absolutely certain that his profound respect for the former appellate judge was being properly documented for the state record. Any previous loyalty or underhanded alliance he held for Donovan Pierce had evaporated like mist on a blistering hot summer morning. Donovan was no longer a weekend golf buddy. He was a dangerous, career-ending liability. Harrison offered a curt professional nod to the bench and took his place beside me at the petitioner's table. He moved with slow, deliberate precision, placing his weathered hands flat on the polished wood surface. "Now then," Harrison said, his voice remarkably calm and even, drawing every ear in the room. "I believe opposing counsel was in the middle of presenting a formal motion to suppress evidence. Please continue, Mr. Pierce. We are all listening very closely." Donovan swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. The sharp, confident attorney who had threatened to bankrupt me just yesterday was now physically trembling. He wiped a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand and forced himself to look up at the judge. "Your Honor," Donovan began, his voice completely lacking all of its previous theatrical resonance and predatory bite. "As I was stating, the respondent formally moves to suppress the petitioner's financial audit. We argue that the documents were obtained without a proper legal subpoena from my client's protected commercial workspace within the marital home. Therefore, the evidence violates the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine and must be deemed entirely inadmissible in this civil proceeding." Donovan looked down at his yellow legal pad, utterly unable to meet Harrison's piercing gaze. The silence that followed his stuttering, desperate argument was heavy, thick, and absolute. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs as I waited for the legal trap to spring shut. Harrison did not stand up. He did not raise his voice, nor did he pound his fist on the table in objection. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket, pulled out the single piece of paper we had discussed at the corner cafe, and handed it directly to me without a single word. I took the document, my hand steady, and stood up carefully, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit jacket. "Your Honor," I said, projecting my voice clearly and confidently across the silent courtroom. "Opposing counsel's motion relies on a fundamental, fatal misunderstanding of federal privacy law. I would like to submit into evidence this federal appellate ruling. According to this binding precedent-setting ruling, the expectation of marital privacy in a commercial workspace is immediately and permanently nullified when that space is actively utilized to commit federal tax evasion and wire fraud against corporate shareholders." I paused for a deliberate moment, letting the heavy legal words sink into the room as the court bailiff walked over to take the document from my outstretched hand. He carried it up the steps to the bench and handed it directly to Judge Miller. "Because my husband deliberately used those specific Home Office files to illegally siphon corporate dividend funds across state lines." I continued, keeping my gaze locked firmly on Lance's terrified face. My discovery was not an illegal search. It was the exposure of an active, ongoing federal crime, therefore. The master binder of financial evidence I have submitted is entirely admissible under federal law, and opposing counsel's motion to suppress is completely without merit. Judge Miller stared down at the piece of paper like it was a live ticking grenade resting on his desk. He read the highlighted text carefully, his eyes widening in horror as he fully comprehended the inescapable legal corner Donovan had just tried to back him into. If he granted Donovan's motion now, he would be directly violating established federal precedent right in front of the fearsome chairman of the State Bar Ethics and Disciplinary Committee. It would be absolute career suicide, resulting in his immediate removal from the bench. "This federal precedent is absolute and binding," Judge Miller announced, quickly, his voice cracking slightly in his eager desperation to distance himself from Donovan. "The respondent's motion to suppress evidence is firmly denied. The petitioner's financial binder is officially admitted into the court record in its entirety." A sharp, collective gasp echoed loudly from the public gallery behind us. I heard Barbara shifting aggressively in her wooden seat, her heavy jewelry clanking, while Brittany let out a high-pitched, confused whine, entirely unable to understand why they were suddenly losing. Donovan simply closed his eyes and let his head drop, realizing his entire defensive legal strategy had just been completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. His argument had not just been defeated, it had been exposed on the official record as legally frivolous and bordering dangerously on professional malpractice. Harrison turned his piercing, unwavering gaze away from the defeated attorney and locked his eyes directly onto Lance. My husband was sitting rigidly in his plush leather chair, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He was breathing heavily through his nose, completely unaccustomed to losing control of any situation, let alone one he thought he had rigged in his favor. "Your Honor," Harrison said, his calm voice cutting smoothly through the quiet, panicked murmurs of the gallery behind us. "Now that the financial evidence has been properly admitted into the record, I believe it is absolutely imperative that we address the immediate and ongoing nature of these severe financial crimes. The respondent has submitted a sworn financial affidavit to this court claiming he is entirely destitute and unable to offer a fair marital settlement. Yet we have verified reason to believe he is actively liquidating stolen marital assets as we speak." Judge Miller leaned forward eagerly, frantically wiping his brow with a white linen handkerchief. "What exactly are you proposing, Justice Caldwell?" "I am requesting that the respondent, Mr. Lance, take the witness stand and be placed under oath immediately." Harrison stated his commanding tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate or objection. "I would like the petitioner to question him directly regarding the origin of the massive, newly freed-up cash he used to purchase a luxury Porsche sports car at a local dealership earlier this very morning." The words hit the respondent's table like a localized earthquake, shattering the very foundation of Lance's fabricated reality. Lance jerked his head violently toward Donovan, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated panic. The arrogant tech executive who had mocked me relentlessly in the hallway just an hour ago was now looking at his lawyer with desperate, pleading eyes. "Donovan, do something!" Lance hissed, his voice tight and breathless with rising fear. "Object to this right now. Tell the judge I do not have to testify about the car." But Donovan Pierce remained completely frozen in his seat, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own impending ruin. The high-powered attorney was sweating profusely, staring blankly down at his yellow legal pad. He knew with absolute certainty that if he attempted to object or illegally shield his client from questioning regarding active federal fraud, Justice Caldwell would immediately open a formal disciplinary investigation against him. Donovan was absolutely not going to risk being permanently disbarred and losing his lucrative career just to save a sinking ship. "I highly advise you to take the stand," Lance Donovan whispered harshly, keeping his head bowed and completely abandoning his client to the impending slaughter. "I cannot object to this federal precedent. You are entirely on your own." Lance stared at his lawyer in sheer, horrified disbelief. The absolute, undeniable betrayal shattered whatever remaining shred of confidence he held. He slowly pushed his chair back, his hands visibly trembling uncontrollably as he stood up in the dead, silent courtroom. He walked heavily toward the elevated wooden witness box, his expensive, custom-tailored suit suddenly looking far too big for his shrinking, defeated frame. He raised his shaking right hand and swore under penalty of perjury to tell the absolute truth. He took his seat in the witness box looking utterly terrified as the reality of his trapped situation settled over him. I stood up from the petitioner's table, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. I walked steadily to the center of the courtroom floor and slowly opened the heavy cover of my color-coded master binder, prepared to deliver the final killing blow. I looked directly at Lance, letting the heavy silence stretch out. He shifted in the witness box, gripping the railing. Sweat gleamed on his forehead. I took a slow breath, feeling calm. For 10 years, I shrank to make room for his ego. Today, I took my power back, Lance. I began, my voice perfectly even. Direct your attention to Section 2 of the binder. Turn to the bank statements marked with red tabs dated 3 weeks prior to your divorce filing. Lance hesitated, throwing a pleading look toward Donovan. Donovan simply stared at his legal pad, paralyzed by Justice Caldwell. Realizing no one would save him, Lance clumsily flipped open the heavy binder. His hands shook so violently the paper rattled. "Do you recognize the routing numbers on those offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands?" I asked. "I am not sure," Lance stammered. "I have many accounts for international business operations. It is hard to keep track without my financial team." "Answer the question directly," Judge Miller barked, eager to appease Harrison. "Do not play games. Do you recognize those offshore accounts?" "Yes," Lance muttered. "They are mine." "Thank you," I said smoothly. "Turn to the next page featuring yellow tabs. You will see the mortgage agreement for a luxury condominium downtown. The exact condominium where your girlfriend resides. Verify the 2 signatures at the bottom." Lance stared at the page, flushing crimson. "The first signature is mine," he mumbled, "and the second signature I pressed. The primary financial guarantor line. Whose name is written there?" He gritted his teeth. "It is your name." "And did I sign that document?" I asked, my voice ringing. "Did I agree to guarantee an apartment for your mistress?" Lance breathed heavily like a cornered animal. "No," he whispered. "Speak up," for the court reporter Harrison interjected, his tone mild but firm. "No, you did not sign it," Lance shouted, his temper fraying. "I signed it for you. It was a simple administrative shortcut. I was going to pay it off anyway, so it did not matter whose name was on the dotted line." I nodded, letting his blatant admission of forgery hang in the quiet air. "It matters very much to the federal government when you forge a signature on a bank loan," I corrected him coldly. "But let us move on to the most important question. You testified under oath in your financial affidavit that your tech company is currently experiencing a severe cash flow deficit, leaving you with virtually no liquid assets. Yet, you purchased a brand new Porsche in cash this morning. Furthermore, you transferred $2.5 million to finalize the condo purchase last month. Where exactly did that massive influx of cash come from?" This was the ultimate trap. Lance was a man completely driven by his own toxic narcissism. He could not stand looking incompetent in public, especially not in front of the woman he considered beneath him. He puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim a shred of dignity. "It was a corporate executive bonus," Lance stated defiantly. "My company just went public to massive success. As the founder and chief executive officer, I was awarded a discretionary bonus for my outstanding leadership. It is my personal money, and it has nothing to do with our marital estate." I felt a cold, satisfying smile spread across my face. He had walked right into the snare. I turned back to my table and picked up a thin blue folder. I handed a copy to the court bailiff to pass up to the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing with triumph, "I would like to submit into evidence the official Securities and Exchange Commission filings for my husband's technology company, updated yesterday evening. I have highlighted the specific corporate accounts from which the $2.5 million were withdrawn." I turned back to Lance, locking onto his terrified face. "That money was not an executive bonus, Lance. According to your own federally mandated corporate filings, there were no executive bonuses approved by your board of directors this quarter. The money you used to buy that luxury sports car today, and the money you used to buy that condominium, was transferred directly from the shareholder dividend accounts. You did not earn that money. You siphoned it directly from the pockets of your own investors. You stole it." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps. In the gallery, Barbara clutched her chest, her jaw dropping in sheer horror. Brittany let out a loud sob, finally realizing the lavish lifestyle she thought she had secured was built entirely on stolen funds. Lance's face contorted into a mask of unadulterated rage. The meticulously maintained facade of the untouchable tech visionary shattered, leaving behind nothing but an arrogant, petulant child throwing a temper tantrum because he had been caught. He gripped the edges of the witness stand, leaning forward so aggressively I thought he might lunge at me.
"You owe me that money!"
Lance screamed, his voice echoing violently off the dark oak walls, completely losing his mind. I built that company from the ground up. I am the visionary. I am the genius who made it happen. You are just a glorified human calculator. You sit in a boring cubicle and count other people's money because you do not have the talent or the ambition to create anything of your own. You drained the best years of my life with your miserable, barren existence. I took that money because I deserved it. I earned it. It belongs to me, not to some faceless shareholders, and sure as hell not to you. His furious outburst echoed into the stunned silence of the room. He was panting heavily, his face drenched in sweat, his eyes wide and manic. He had completely destroyed his own credibility, exposing his true, ugly nature to the entire court. He had just confessed, in a fit of narcissistic rage, to stealing millions of dollars because he felt entitled to it. The sharp, deafening crack of a wooden gavel slamming against the bench jolted everyone. Judge Miller was standing up, his face a mixture of absolute disgust and profound alarm. "That is enough!" Judge Miller roared, pointing his gavel directly at Lance. "You will cease your yelling immediately, sir, or I will have you restrained and held in contempt of court." Lance froze, suddenly realizing the catastrophic magnitude of what he had just done. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a sickening, hollow realization. He looked at the judge, then down at me, his chest heaving as the room spun around him. Judge Miller adjusted his robes and looked down at the Securities and Exchange Commission documents resting on his desk. He read through the highlighted sections, his expression growing grimmer with every passing second. The judge then looked over at Harrison, who was sitting perfectly still at the petitioner's table, watching the proceedings with the calm, satisfied expression of a man who had just won a chess match in 3 moves. Judge Miller slowly lowered his gavel. He turned his gaze away from the witness box and looked directly across the courtroom at the respondent's table, where Donovan Pierce was sitting with his head buried in his hands. The judge delivered a chilling, absolute statement that sealed my husband's fate forever. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Miller said, his voice cold and unforgiving, "your client just confessed to federal wire fraud on my record." The silence that followed Judge Miller's chilling declaration was absolute. Lance sat frozen in the witness box, the color completely drained from his face. His mouth opened and closed silently, but no words came out. He had spent his entire life talking his way out of consequences, using his charm and his mother's money to pave over his mistakes. But there was no charm that could erase a sworn confession to a federal crime, especially not with Justice Caldwell watching the proceedings with eyes like chipped ice. Judge Miller turned his attention back to the bench, moving with sudden energy. Desperate to save his own career, he was entirely eager to sacrifice Lance to prove his unwavering dedication to the law in front of the formidable ethics chairman. He adjusted his heavy black robes, picked up his silver pen, and began writing furiously on the official docket. Based on the evidence presented in this admitted binder and the respondent's own sworn testimony, I am issuing an immediate and comprehensive emergency injunction, Judge Miller announced. I hereby order the immediate freezing of all domestic and offshore banking accounts associated with Lance and his corporate entities. I am also freezing all related real estate assets. No money moves and no property is sold or transferred without my direct, explicit authorization. Lance slumped forward, gripping the wooden railing of the witness box so hard his knuckles turned completely white. His breathing became shallow and rapid as the reality of his total financial ruin began to set in. Furthermore, Judge Miller continued, his tone devoid of loyalty to Donovan Pierce. I find the proposed settlement predatory, fraudulent, and void. Given the deliberate concealment of assets, forged marital documents, and severe financial abuse, I award the petitioner, Ms. Whitney, 100% of the marital estate. For clarity, that estate includes Lance's 51% controlling interest in Preston Technologies, whose value was built and increased during this marriage. I sat perfectly still at the petitioner's table, my heart pounding a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. 10 years of my life had been drained by this man. Now, in a matter of minutes, everything he had tried to steal from me was being returned, legally and permanently. But Judge Miller was not finished. He looked directly at me, offering a respectful nod before continuing his ruling. In addition to the entire marital estate, the respondent is hereby ordered to pay all of the petitioner's legal fees. Furthermore, due to the egregious and calculated nature of the financial abuse, I am awarding the petitioner maximum punitive damages. The respondent will be stripped of everything he owns to satisfy this judgment. A sharp noise escaped Lance's throat. It was the sound of a man watching his empire burn to the ground. Judge Miller set his pen down and folded his hands. He then turned his gaze toward the court bailiff standing rigidly by the side door. "Bailiff," the judge ordered, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "I want you to take immediate possession of the petitioner's master binder. You will copy every single page, including the authenticated bank records, the offshore routing numbers, and the federal corporate tax filings. You will also pull the official court transcript of the respondent's sworn testimony from this morning." The bailiff stepped forward immediately, walking toward my table to collect the heavy binder. "Once you have compiled those documents," Judge Miller instructed, leaning forward to ensure his commands were perfectly understood by everyone in the room, particularly Justice Caldwell, "you will deliver them directly to the United States Attorney's Office. You will place them personally into the hands of the federal prosecutor assigned to financial crimes. I am officially referring this matter for immediate criminal investigation regarding multiple counts of federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and forgery." Lance let out a loud gasp. He stumbled backward, collapsing hard onto the wooden bench. Prison. The word hung unspoken in the heavy air. He was not just losing his company and his money. He was going to a federal penitentiary. The sheer magnitude of the judge's ruling finally shattered the stunned silence in the public gallery. Barbara, who had been sitting frozen in horror, suddenly erupted. She shot up from her wooden bench, her heavy gold bracelets clanking violently as she pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Judge Miller.
You cannot do this!
Barbara screamed, her shrill voice tearing through the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. "You are stealing my son's money. You are all a bunch of corrupt, incompetent fools. You cannot take everything he owns and give it to this barren gold digger." Her face was mottled with dark red patches of uncontrollable rage. She stomped her expensive heel against the floor, ignoring the shocked gasps of the remaining gallery members.
"I will have your job for this!"
Barbara shrieked, leaning aggressively over the wooden partition. "I know people in this city. I have powerful friends. I will ruin you. I will ruin all of you." Judge Miller did not even flinch. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Madam, you are dangerously out of line," Judge Miller roared, his face flushing with matching anger. "You will be silent immediately, or I will hold you in direct contempt of this court." But Barbara was far too accustomed to getting her way. "I will not be silent," she screeched. "That money belongs to the Wilson family. You are committing a crime. I demand you reverse this decision right this second." Judge Miller slammed his gavel down twice more, pointing a rigid finger at the wealthy matriarch. "That is enough. I find you in direct contempt of court," the judge bellowed. "Bailiffs, remove that woman from my courtroom immediately. Place her in a holding cell to cool off." Two heavily armed court security officers instantly lunged forward. They grabbed Barbara by her arms, halting her chaotic advance. For a split second, she looked utterly bewildered. Then, her bewilderment turned into wild, thrashing panic. "Take your hands off me!" Barbara shrieked, struggling violently against their firm grip. "Do you know who I am? Let go of me! My coat costs more than you make in a year!" The security guards completely ignored her protests. They forcefully dragged her backward down the center aisle. Her designer heels scuffed awkwardly against the polished marble floor, and her fur coat slipped half off her shoulders, leaving her looking completely humiliated. She kicked and screamed the entire way, her shrill voice echoing even after the heavy oak doors swung shut behind her. The heavy thud of the gavel signaled the absolute end. Lance pushed himself up from the witness box, looking like a hollow shell of a man. He stumbled down the wooden steps and walked unsteadily toward the respondents' table. He was entirely destitute. He looked at Donovan Pierce, who was calmly and methodically packing his legal pads and silver pens into his sleek, expensive leather briefcase. Donovan Lance pleaded, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. "You have to fix this! You have to file an immediate appeal. Call the judge right now. You said we had this in the bag. We cannot lose." Donovan finally snapped the heavy golden latches of his briefcase shut. He looked Lance directly and coldly in the eyes. "You are on your own. I am not losing my license for you," and walks out. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind the retreating attorney. Lance stood completely frozen. He stared at the empty space where his lawyer had just been sitting, his mouth slightly ajar. The untouchable tech visionary was gone, entirely replaced by a terrified man who had just realized the floor beneath him had collapsed. I did not feel pity for him. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Harrison tapped his wooden cane against the polished floor, drawing my attention. "We have accomplished what we came here to do, Whitney," he said. "It is time to leave him to his consequences." I nodded, picking up my master binder. Its weight felt entirely different now. It was the instrument of my liberation. We walked slowly down the center aisle, leaving Lance standing alone. The air in the hallway outside was loud and chaotic, but as we stepped through the heavy doors, a sudden sharp voice cut through the ambient noise.
Are you out of your mind?
Brittany shrieked. Her shrill voice instantly drew the attention of many bystanders. She stood a few feet away, her hands balled into tight fists. Lance stumbled out of the courtroom right behind us, pale and disoriented. He reached out toward her, but she aggressively swatted his hand away.
"Do not touch me!"
Brittany screamed. "I just talked to Barbara. She told me the judge froze everything. She said you confessed to a federal crime and the judge is sending your file to the prosecutor. Is that true, Lance?" Lance looked frantically around the hallway, noting the onlookers who had stopped to watch. "Keep your voice down, Brittany," he pleaded in a desperate whisper. "I can fix this. I just need to call my board of directors. I still have leverage." "You have absolutely nothing," Brittany yelled, ignoring his plea. "Your mother is in a holding cell, and your lawyer just ran out. You told me we were going to be rich. You promised me the condo was paid for and that the Porsche was mine. You said your wife would walk away with a tiny settlement. Now the judge says the money belongs to her and you stole it." Lance stepped forward, trying to grab her arm. "Baby, please, you have to listen to me," he begged. "We can fly out of the country tonight before any federal charges are filed. I have friends who can help us disappear." Brittany let out a loud, bitter laugh. "Fly out of the country on what money, Lance? All your accounts are frozen. You cannot even buy a plane ticket. You are a fraud. I am not going to federal prison with you, and I am not staying with a broke criminal." She ripped her arm away from him. "We are completely done, Lance. Do not ever contact me again." She turned on her heels and stormed down the corridor, leaving him humiliated in front of the entire courthouse. Lance watched her walk away, his shoulders slumping as the final pillar of his life crumbled. The crowd in the hallway was openly staring. He slowly turned his head and saw me standing near the elevator bank with Harrison. The arrogant smirk had vanished entirely. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. He took a stumbling step forward until he was practically running toward us. "Whitney, wait!" Lance shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He closed the distance between us and completely collapsed. He fell hard onto his knees on the cold marble floor directly in front of me. He grabbed the hem of my charcoal suit skirt, holding onto the fabric like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. "Whitney, please, you have to help me," Lance sobbed. Actual tears were streaming down his face, ruining his carefully maintained image. "I am so sorry. I never should have treated you that way. Please, I am begging you. You have to go back inside and tell the judge you made a mistake. Tell him the binder is full of errors. You are a brilliant auditor, Whitney. You can easily convince them the numbers were wrong. If you do not withdraw that evidence, I am going to federal prison. I will not survive in a place like that." I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet. For a decade, this man had systematically dismantled my self-esteem. He had mocked my career and flaunted his infidelity in my face while trying to leave me destitute. Now, stripped of his lawyer, his mistress, his company, and his pride, he was begging the woman he had abused to save his life. I did not pull my skirt away from his grasp. I did not yell at him. The rage had burned itself out completely, leaving behind nothing but a profound, icy calm. I looked down into his red, weeping eyes and spoke with absolute, steady clarity. "I am an auditor, Lance," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent hallway. "I do not create the numbers, and I do not erase them. I just balance the books, and your debt is past due." I peeled his trembling fingers off my skirt. His hands fell limply to his sides, and he slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold floor. He let out a long wail that sounded like a wounded animal. I turned to Harrison, who offered a respectful nod. We turned our backs on the broken man and began walking toward the large glass doors at the end of the corridor. As we walked away, the heavy sound of marching boots approached. I glanced over my shoulder and saw two uniformed police officers walking briskly down the hallway. They bypassed the crowd of onlookers and walked directly toward Lance, who was still weeping uncontrollably. I paused, watching the scene unfold from afar. "Lance Preston," one of the officers demanded, his voice loud and authoritative. Lance slowly lifted his head, his face a mess of tears. "Yes," he choked out. "What is if now? Please tell me you are here to escort me out." The officers exchanged a professional look before stepping closer. "Mr. Preston, please stand up and place your hands behind your back," the taller officer instructed, reaching to unclip heavy silver handcuffs from his duty belt. "You are under official arrest." Lance stared at them in utter bewilderment. "Arrest?" he stammered, struggling to stand on shaking legs. "But the judge just referred the fraud case 10 minutes ago." "The federal prosecutor cannot possibly have a warrant ready this fast." The second officer grabbed Lance's arm and firmly pulled it behind his back, securing the metal cuff. "We are not here for federal wire fraud, Mr. Preston," the officer stated plainly. "We are here regarding a grand larceny complaint filed earlier this week. The petitioner, Ms. Whitney Preston, officially updated her police report yesterday regarding a highly valuable stolen antique diamond heirloom ring. We just spoke with Brittany in the parking lot. She identified you as having removed the ring from your wife's jewelry box and given it to her. Another officer is questioning her now and securing the stolen property for return to Ms. Preston." Lance let out a sharp, terrified gasp as the second steel cuff clicked securely into place around his wrist. He looked frantically down the long hallway, locking eyes with me one final time as the officers forcefully began to march him away toward the exit. The trap had closed perfectly. "You have the right to remain silent," the taller officer recited smoothly. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This cannot be happening," Lance sputtered, flushing red. "You have the wrong man. I am a chief executive officer. I run a major technology firm. I do not steal jewelry." The officer tightened his grip on Lance's arm and began marching him forward. "We have a sworn statement from the recipient, Mr. Preston. You can explain your position to the detective at the precinct." The hallway was packed with people. Lawyers and clerks pulled out their phones to capture the spectacle. A local business reporter pushed to the front, his camera flashing repeatedly. Lance tried to hide his face, but it was too late. The untouchable corporate titan was now being paraded past his peers like a common thief. The whispers of the crowd swelled into a loud, damning chorus. I watched him shuffle past me. There was no pity left in my heart. He had forged my signature, drained our accounts, and tried to leave me with nothing but debt and a shattered reputation. The humiliation he was experiencing right now was entirely of his own making. Harrison stood quietly at my side, observing the scene. He offered a slight nod of approval. I turned my attention away from Lance and looked down the corridor. Near the large glass exit doors, Brittany was surrounded by onlookers. A second police officer stood in front of her, holding a small notepad and asking her questions. She was shaking her head frantically, gesturing wildly. I walked slowly toward them, the heavy master binders still tucked securely under my arm. As I approached, I could hear Brittany's high-pitched, frantic voice. "I had no idea it was stolen," she practically screamed. "He told me it was a custom piece specifically for me. I would never accept stolen property. I'm a victim here too." The officer looked skeptical. "Ignorance of the law does not exempt you, ma'am," he stated flatly. "It belongs to Ms. Whitney Preston, and it must be returned immediately, or you face charges for receiving stolen property." Brittany let out a loud, pathetic sob. She looked up and saw me standing just a few feet away. The sheer panic in her eyes was unmistakable. The arrogant young woman who had proudly flaunted my grandmother's diamond on her finger was entirely gone. In her place stood a terrified girl who had just realized that her wealthy prize was actually a criminal facing federal prison. I stopped directly in front of her. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer any insults. I simply extended my right hand, palm facing upward, and waited. Brittany's breath hitched. She looked at my open hand, then down at the glittering heirloom ring on her own finger. For a brief second, she hesitated, her fingers curling inward protectively. But the officer cleared his throat, resting his hand casually on his utility belt. The threat of arrest hung heavily in the quiet air between us. Humiliated, with dozens of cell phone cameras recording her every move, Brittany reached over and awkwardly pulled the heavy diamond ring off her finger. Her hands were shaking violently. She placed the cold metal into my waiting palm without making eye contact. I closed my fingers around the ring, feeling my grandmother's legacy safely returned. "Thank you," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly controlled. "I suggest you find your own ride home, Brittany. The Porsche has been frozen by the court." She let out a strangled sob, covering her face, and pushed her way blindly through the crowd to escape the humiliation. I slipped the ring into the pocket of my suit jacket. I turned and walked through the glass doors of the courthouse, stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight. Harrison walked just ahead of me. Below us, the scene was chaotic. A police cruiser was parked out front, its lights flashing brightly. The officers guided Lance down the final steps. He was stumbling. As they pushed him into the back of the cruiser, a loud shriek tore through the air. "Lance! My baby!" I looked to the right and saw Barbara standing near the bottom of the steps. She had just been released from the holding cell, her fur coat wrinkled. The wealthy, intimidating matriarch looked entirely unhinged. She rushed toward the police cruiser, her arms outstretched, sobbing uncontrollably. "You cannot take him!" she screamed at the officers. "He is a good boy! He is the chief executive officer! You are making a terrible mistake!" "Ma'am, step back immediately," the officer ordered. "If you interfere, you will be joining him in this vehicle." Barbara froze, her face contorting in sheer agony as the officer slammed the cruiser door shut. She pressed her hands against the glass window, crying heavily, as Lance stared back at her from the cramped back seat. He looked entirely broken, a hollow shell of his former self. The police cruiser pulled away from the curb, its siren wailing briefly to clear the intersection. Barbara collapsed onto the bottom step of the courthouse, sobbing, completely abandoned and disgraced. I watched the cruiser disappear around the corner. I was finally and completely free. Harrison paused at the bottom of the steps, waiting for me to catch up. A sleek, perfectly polished black town car pulled up directly to the curb, its driver stepping out to open the rear door for us. "Shall we?" Harrison asked, gesturing toward the open door. We stepped into the quiet, luxurious interior of the town car. The soft leather seats offered a welcome comfort. As the driver finally pulled away from the courthouse, the silence in the car felt peaceful. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace today," Whitney Harrison said, breaking the silence. "Your preparation was flawless, and your execution under pressure was truly exceptional. It has been a long time since I have seen an audit weaponized with such precision." "Thank you, Justice Caldwell," I replied, clutching my binder, resting on my lap. "I could not have done it without your guidance." Harrison chuckled softly and reached inside his suit jacket. He handed me an embossed business card from a prestigious international forensic accounting firm in New York. He removed a sealed cream envelope and placed it beneath the card. "I have known their managing directors for years," he explained. "Their corporate fraud division needs a senior partner, and this morning I sent them your resume, public case history, and a detailed summary of today's work. They verified your credentials during the hearing." I stared at the envelope. "You arranged an interview today." "Something better," Harrison replied. "The firm's executive committee authorized a conditional partnership offer, subject only to a background review and your acceptance. They need someone committed to the truth, and your audit demonstrated that quality." I broke the seal carefully. My hands tightened around the heavy paper. Inside was an offer letter listing the senior partner title, a starting date, and a compensation package that stole my breath. It was the kind of opportunity I thought would take decades to earn. "They expect your call on Monday," Harrison continued. "I told them the best auditor I know is now available to work somewhere worthy of her." I looked down at the business card and the opened offer letter resting in my lap, the gold lettering catching the afternoon sunlight filtering through the tinted windows of the town car. Senior partner. The title felt immense, carrying the weight of validation I had spent a decade desperately seeking from people who were never going to give it to me. Harrison smiled knowingly and turned his attention to the window as the driver navigated the busy downtown streets. The ride back to the financial district was quiet, giving me time to process the monumental shift in my reality. For so long, I had been shrinking myself to fit into rooms that were simply too small for me. I had let Lance dictate my self-worth at home, and I had let my current employer dictate my professional value at work. But the woman who had walked into that courthouse this morning was not the same woman returning to the office. I slipped the business card into my pocket and secured the offer letter inside my briefcase. When the town car pulled up to the gray, towering office building of my current auditing firm, I thanked Harrison and stepped out onto the pavement. The air felt crisper now. I walked through the revolving glass doors and took the elevator up to the 14th floor. The familiar hum of ringing phones and clacking keyboards greeted me. The drab beige walls and narrow cubicles felt suffocating, a stark reminder of the mediocrity I had settled for. I walked past the junior accountants who did not even look up from their spreadsheets. I was making my way toward my small, windowless cubicle when a sharp, irritated voice cut through the ambient noise of the floor. "Whitney, my office right now." It was Greg, the senior managing partner. He stood in the doorway of his corner office, holding a stack of disorganized files, his face flushed with his permanent state of manufactured urgency. Greg was the man who had passed me over for promotion 3 years in a row. He had repeatedly told me I was a competent number cruncher, but completely lacked the killer instinct necessary to handle high-stakes corporate clients. I did not rush. I walked at an even, deliberate pace, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I stepped into his office, and before I could even take a seat, he tossed a thick, chaotic file onto his mahogany desk. "I need the preliminary risk assessment on the Peterson account finished by midnight tonight," Greg demanded, not bothering to look at me. "The client is breathing down my neck and the data they sent over is a complete mess. You are going to have to manually reconcile the last 4 quarters." I looked at the file, then back at Greg. The Peterson account was a low-level, tedious assignment that typically went to first-year associates. It was grunt work, pure and simple. Greg finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in my charcoal suit and calm demeanor. "And let me make something perfectly clear, Whitney," he continued, his tone turning aggressive and patronizing. "I know you had some personal legal drama to deal with this morning, but I am running a business here. I cannot have your messy divorce interfering with my bottom line. If you cannot manage to balance your personal life and deliver this report by midnight, we are going to have a very serious conversation about your future at this firm. You have been coasting for months. If you want to keep your job, you need to show me some actual dedication." He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms, fully expecting me to apologize. Yesterday, I would have felt the familiar knot of anxiety and agreed to his unreasonable demands. But today, looking at Greg, I felt absolutely nothing but pity. I did not apologize. Instead, I let out a soft, genuine laugh. Greg blinked, clearly thrown off. He uncrossed his arms, leaning forward. "Do you think this is funny?" he asked, his face turning a deeper shade of red. "I think it is incredibly funny, Greg," I replied, my voice steady. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my company identification badge. I unclipped the lanyard and placed it gently on top of the messy Peterson file. "I will not be completing that risk assessment, and I will not be having a conversation about my future at this firm. I am resigning, effective immediately." Greg stared at the badge, then let out a scoff. "You are quitting?" he asked mockingly. "Because I asked you to do your job? Where exactly do you think you are going to go, Whitney? You do not have the killer instinct to make it at a top-tier firm. You should be grateful you even have a job here." I smiled warmly. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the thick, embossed envelope Harrison Caldwell had handed me. I pulled out the official offer letter from the prestigious New York firm and placed it right next to my discarded badge. I slid it across the polished mahogany toward him. "You are absolutely right, Greg," I said smoothly. "I am not cut out for this firm. I am moving to New York. I suggest you read the details." Greg frowned, picking up the heavy paper. His eyes scanned the letterhead, recognizing the premier forensic accounting firm immediately. I watched as his eyes darted down the page, landing on the bolded compensation package. The color instantly drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "The starting salary is exactly triple what you make as a managing partner here," I informed him, keeping my tone pleasant. "And it comes with a full senior partnership. They specifically sought me out because my audits are considered the most lethal in the industry. So you can keep your grunt work, and you can keep your threats." Greg stammered, holding the paper with trembling hands. "Whitney, this is a misunderstanding. We can counteroffer." I shook my head, retrieving my letter. There is nothing to discuss. Have a nice life, Greg. I turned and walked out of his office, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. I did not look back. I stepped out of the building and onto the bustling sidewalk, the late afternoon sun warming my face. The city felt entirely different now, full of endless, thrilling possibilities. As I began walking toward the subway station, my cell phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The caller identification displayed the luxury property management company overseeing the downtown condominium. The exact condominium Lance had purchased for Brittany. I answered the call. "Hello," I said calmly. "Ms. Whitney Preston," a male voice asked. "This is Michael, the property manager. We received a transfer order from Judge Miller naming you as the condominium's legal owner. Lance purchased the unit last month, but today's injunction froze the operating account that covers maintenance and escrow charges. Brittany is in the lobby demanding access, and Barbara has entered the penthouse with a courier. Building security believes they are packing furniture and artwork. Because the residence and its contents now belong to you, we need instructions before anything leaves the premises." I smiled at the perfect poetic reversal. "Deny Brittany entry, preserve every security recording, and call the police," I said. "Evict them." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as my town car pulled up to the Pinnacle Tower. It was the most exclusive luxury condominium building in the city, boasting private elevator access. It was exactly where Lance had secretly purchased a penthouse for his mistress, using funds systematically siphoned from our joint accounts. I stepped out onto the pristine pavement, the cool breeze catching the edge of my coat. I was not alone. Flanking me were 2 uniformed police officers I had requested for a civil standby, a necessary precaution for what I was about to do. I held a thick manila folder containing the emergency injunction and property transfer orders signed by Judge Miller just hours ago. The settlement had been nullified, and every asset purchased with stolen marital funds had been awarded completely to me. We walked through the immaculate marble lobby, bypassing the stunned concierge, and stepped directly into the private elevator. The silent ride to the top floor gave me a moment to reflect on Lance's betrayal. As the doors slid open directly into the expansive penthouse foyer, the lingering sting of his deception was eclipsed by the chaotic scene unfolding in front of me. The penthouse was an absolute disaster zone. The sprawling living room, decorated with expensive modern taste, was littered with open cardboard boxes and heavy plastic shipping crates. Standing in the middle of the chaos, clutching a priceless abstract sculpture wrapped hastily in bubble wrap, was Barbara. My former mother-in-law looked completely unhinged. Her meticulously styled hair was a disheveled mess, and her designer blouse was covered in dust. She was barking frantic orders at a terrified private courier, who was struggling to tape a large art box shut. Barbara was desperately packing up Brittany's expensive furniture designer handbags and high-end artwork. It was incredibly obvious what she was doing. With Lance's accounts completely frozen and his assets locked down by a federal court order, she had no access to the liquid cash required to post his bail. She had rushed over to strip the penthouse bare, intending to fence the luxury items on the black market to buy her golden child's freedom. I stepped into the main living space, my heels clicking sharply against the imported hardwood floor. The 2 police officers followed closely behind me, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere in the room. Barbara froze, nearly dropping the heavy sculpture. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she registered my presence, and then her shock rapidly morphed into sheer, unadulterated venom. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You have absolutely no right to be in this building. Get out before I call security and have you arrested for trespassing." She practically threw the wrapped sculpture onto a nearby velvet sofa and marched aggressively toward me, her arms flailing wildly.
You have done enough damage for one day, Whitney. You put my son in a police cruiser. You froze our family money. Now you are trying to harass me while I try to save his life? I need this art. I need this furniture. It belongs to my son.
And I am selling it to pay his bail. She stepped directly into my path, physically blocking me from moving any further into the condominium. She planted her feet and crossed her arms, her face flushed dark red with desperation and rage.
You are not taking another step, she snarled, spit flying from her lips. This is Lance's property. He bought it and he furnished it. You have already ruined his company and his marriage. I will not let you take the last thing he has left. Turn around and get back in that elevator right now.
Her hostility was palpable, a desperate animal fighting for survival she did not deserve. In the past, her aggressive intimidation tactics would have sent me retreating. I would have backed down, apologized, and let her bulldoze her way through my boundaries just to keep the peace. But the woman who used to cower before Barbara Preston was completely gone. I did not flinch, and I did not take a single step backward. I did not raise my voice, and I did not engage in her hysterical screaming match. Instead, I calmly turned to the taller of the two police officers standing at my side. I opened my manila folder and extracted the heavy court order bearing the official seal of the state court. "Officer," I said smoothly, handing him the document, "this is an emergency property transfer and injunction signed by Judge Miller this morning. It explicitly awards this specific property and all of its contents entirely to me. It also strictly forbids the removal, sale, or transfer of any items currently inside this residence." The officer took the document, his eyes scanning the bold legal text and the judge's signature. He nodded respectfully, understanding the situation immediately. He then stepped smoothly around me, placing himself directly between Barbara and myself. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice carrying the deep, unwavering authority of the law, "you need to step back right now. The property you are attempting to pack up does not belong to your son, and it certainly does not belong to you. According to this court order, everything in this penthouse is the sole legal property of Ms. Whitney Preston. You are currently attempting to remove stolen assets, which is a criminal offense. I suggest you put down anything you are currently holding." Barbara stared at him, her jaw dropping open in utter disbelief. She looked from the officer to the legal document in his hand, and then back to me. The reality of her total defeat was finally crashing down upon her. "You cannot do this," she whimpered, her voice cracking as the fight completely drained out of her. "He is my son. He is sitting in a jail cell. I need to get him out. Please, Whitney, you cannot take this from us too." I looked at her without a single ounce of pity. "You took from me for 10 years, Barbara," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "You enabled his abuse. You covered up his lies, and you sat in a courtroom today and demanded a judge leave me with absolutely nothing. You do not get to ask me for mercy now." I turned back to the officers. "I want her removed from my property immediately." The officers did not hesitate. The second officer stepped forward, grabbing Barbara firmly by her upper arm. "Let us go, ma'am," he instructed, guiding her forcefully toward the elevator doors. "You are leaving the premises right now. If you return to this building, you will be arrested for trespassing and attempted theft." Barbara let out a wailing sob, slumping her shoulders as the officers marched her away. The courier scrambled out the service elevator, leaving me entirely alone. A professional locksmith arrived minutes later, completely replacing the electronic access panels and physical deadbolts. Securing my absolute control, I walked across the massive living room, ignoring Brittany's packed boxes. I pushed open the glass doors, stepping onto the expansive balcony. Breathing in the cool, clean air, I looked out over the glittering city skyline. I was finally completely free from the relentless torment he inflicted. Smiling quietly to myself, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. It was finally time to directly contact Lance's corporate shareholders. 2 days after making that call, the atmosphere inside the executive boardroom at Preston Technologies was incredibly tense. An emergency shareholder meeting had been called the moment news of Lance's arrest leaked to the press. The long table was surrounded by the company's board of directors, investors who absolutely did not tolerate scandal. At the head of the table stood Lance. He was currently out on bail, wearing a sharp designer suit that desperately attempted to project his usual aura of untouchable authority. However, the dark circles under his wild eyes and the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his deep exhaustion. "Gentlemen, I assure you that the rumors circulating in the media are entirely overblown," Lance said smoothly, his voice dripping with practiced charm. "A disgruntled former employee acting out of spite after being rightfully terminated managed to manipulate our internal accounting software. This rogue individual temporarily transferred funds to unauthorized offshore accounts to frame me for corporate embezzlement. The funds are being recovered as we speak, and my legal team is actively handling the false police report. I ask you for your continued faith as we navigate this distraction." The board members exchanged uncertain glances, murmuring quietly among themselves. Lance offered a reassuring smile, foolishly believing he had successfully contained the immense damage. He reached for his glass of iced water, taking a triumphant sip. But his moment of perceived victory was shattered completely by the sound of the heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom swinging open. I stepped across the threshold and the thick carpet silencing my confident strides. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. The board members looked thoroughly confused by the sudden intrusion, but Lance dropped his water glass instantly. It shattered loudly against the polished mahogany table, cold water pooling around his expensive leather shoes. "What are you doing here?" Lance demanded, his voice cracking loudly, completely losing his carefully composed facade. "Security. Someone get security in here immediately. She does not belong in this building." I ignored his frantic shouting and walked calmly toward the empty chair directly opposite him at the far end of the long table. I placed my briefcase down with a soft, authoritative thud. "I have every right to be in this building, Lance," I stated, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. I opened my briefcase and retrieved a stack of freshly printed legal documents bearing the official seal of the federal court. I handed the first copy to the chairman of the board sitting to my right. At the hearing 2 days ago, the presiding judge nullified Lance's fraudulent settlement proposal due to massive, undeniable financial fraud. In the revised distribution of marital assets, the court awarded me full ownership of all property purchased with stolen funds. Furthermore, the court awarded me total control of the marital estate to satisfy the immense debt you owe me. That includes your entire 51% controlling shareholder stake in this very company. I am not a guest here today. I am the majority owner." A stunned silence washed over the boardroom as the directors scrambled to read the legal decree. Lance grabbed the edge of the table, his face draining of all color until he looked ghostly. "You cannot do this," he gasped, his chest heaving as sheer panic set in. "You do not know anything about running a technology firm. You will destroy everything I have built over the past decade." I looked at him with absolute, unwavering focus. "I know enough about numbers to know exactly when they have been manipulated, Lance." I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out 10 perfectly bound copies of the forensic audit I had prepared with Harrison's expert guidance. I began passing them down the table to the bewildered board members. "What you are holding is a comprehensive, highly detailed and forensic audit of this company's financial records over the past 3 years. It completely contradicts the fairy tale your former chief executive officer just spun for you.
The money was systematically siphoned by Lance himself, using forged vendor invoices and elaborate shell companies registered in the Caribbean. He deliberately used shareholder capital to purchase luxury real estate, expensive artwork, and extremely expensive vehicles for his young mistress. The proof is irrefutable, completely documented with bank statements, and is already in the hands of the federal prosecutor. The sound of pages flipping rapidly filled the quiet room as the investors scrutinized the damning evidence. The color rose furiously in the chairman's face as he read the summarized findings and saw the undeniable paper trail. "This is an absolute outrage," the chairman bellowed, slamming his hand down hard on the table. "You have been stealing our investment capital to fund your personal infidelity and your lavish lifestyle?" Lance threw his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "No, you have to listen to me," he begged, looking frantically around the room, at the men who had once worshipped his bold business moves. "She is lying to you. She fabricated these documents because she is a bitter, jealous former wife trying to ruin me. I am the true visionary here. You need me to secure the next round of venture capital funding. If you listen to her lies, the company's stock will completely plummet." "Your stock is already plummeting because you are facing federal prison," I interrupted coldly, my voice cutting through his hysterical rambling. "Your presence here is the greatest liability this company possesses." I turned my attention away from his pathetic display and addressed the angry board directly. "As the majority shareholder, I am formally initiating an immediate corporate vote. I move to terminate Lance Preston from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." Furthermore, based on the documented evidence of extreme financial misconduct, blatant embezzlement, and severe breach of fiduciary duty, this termination will be strictly for cause. This specific designation immediately strips him of his massive $1 million executive severance package and permanently voids all of his unvested stock options. Lance let out a strangled, breathless cry, stumbling backward away from the wooden podium. "You cannot take my severance!" he yelled, his voice echoing shrilly off the thick glass walls. "I have absolutely nothing left. The court froze all my personal accounts. If you take my severance and my options, I am completely bankrupt. I will not even be able to pay my criminal defense lawyers to keep me out of jail. You are ruining my life, Whitney!" I stared at him, feeling a profound, quiet sense of closure as the final pieces of his manufactured, arrogant empire crumbled around him. "You ruined your own life, Lance," I said simply. "I just audited the damage." I looked toward the chairman. "I vote yes on the motion to terminate for cause." The chairman did not hesitate for a single second. "I vote yes," he declared firmly, glaring at Lance. The word echoed down the line rapidly as every single board member eagerly added their vote. It was completely unanimous. The founder was entirely excised from his creation. The chairman pressed a silver button. "We need security, now," he instructed. Moments later, 3 guards marched toward Lance. "Sir, we need your badge, laptop, and keys." Lance wept quietly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As they escorted him out, the door shut. I looked out the window at the city below. I was in total control of my financial destiny. The transition to my empty marital home felt surreal. The sprawling house now felt like nothing more than a hollow shell. I walked through the closet holding a single moving box. I had no intention of taking much. The shelves were lined with expensive designer handbags, leather shoes, and velvet jewelry boxes. They were all gifts from Lance. Every single item had been a calculated purchase, a shiny distraction meant to keep me quiet, compliant, and completely oblivious to his massive betrayals. I reached out and ran my fingers over the smooth leather of a Birkin bag I had received for our 5th anniversary. I remembered the smile on his face when he handed it to me, a smile I now knew was purchased with stolen shareholder capital. I did not feel a single ounce of attachment to any of it. I left the handbags exactly where they were. I left the diamond tennis bracelets and the platinum watches sitting in their velvet displays. They were nothing but heavy chains of a toxic materialism I was finally shedding. Instead, I carefully packed a small faded photograph of my grandmother, the worn quilt she had knitted for my college graduation, and my favorite coffee mug. I added a few practical business suits and my essential audit manuals. Everything else, the entire fabricated life of Whitney Preston, the dutiful corporate wife, would be left behind for the estate liquidators to inventory and sell. I taped the single box shut, the sharp sound of the adhesive echoing through the empty room. I walked out the front door, leaving the keys on the granite entryway console, and I never looked back once. The airport was bustling when my car pulled up to the curb. The sky was a brilliant blue, perfectly matching the profound clarity I felt. A skycap took my luggage, leaving me carrying only my briefcase. Near the terminal entrance, I saw a familiar figure. Harrison Caldwell stood tall, holding 2 cups of coffee. He smiled as I approached, extending a cup. I took the beverage, touched that he had navigated the chaotic traffic just to see me off. We found a quiet spot overlooking the runways. "You pack remarkably light for a woman moving across the country." Harrison noted, his sharp eyes glancing at my briefcase. I told him I was leaving the heavy baggage where it belonged. He chuckled softly, a deep, rich sound that had become a source of immense comfort over the past few chaotic days. "You possess a truly rare kind of resilience, Whitney," Harrison said, his tone turning serious and reflective. "I have watched countless individuals break under a fraction of the pressure you faced. But you did not just survive the betrayal. You dismantled it with absolute precision. Your sharp mind and your unwavering commitment to the truth are going to make you an absolute terror in New York." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a genuine smile spread across my face. "I learned from the best," I replied sincerely. "I could never have navigated the legal labyrinth without your guidance, Justice Caldwell." Harrison waved a dismissive hand, though the pride in his eyes was evident. "You had the fire inside you all along, my dear. I simply handed you the match." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a beautiful silver engraved pen, handing it to me. "For signing your partnership agreement," he explained. I accepted the heavy pen, running my thumb over the intricate engraving. "Thank you, Harrison, for everything." He pulled me into a brief fatherly embrace. "Go conquer the financial world, senior partner," he said warmly, "and expect a visit from me the moment you settle into your new corner office." I promised him the best steak in Manhattan, gave him one last smile, and turned to walk through the security checkpoint. The premium lounge and expedited security clearance made the journey to my gate entirely effortless. I boarded the heavy commercial aircraft, stepping directly into the luxurious first-class cabin. The wide, plush leather seat embraced me as I settled in, offering a stark, beautiful contrast to the harsh reality I had occupied just a week ago. I remembered that fateful flight home, crammed into a tiny economy seat, sitting rigidly as I refused to cry while reading Lance's threatening demand for my total surrender. That woman felt like a distant memory, a ghost from a past life who had been completely consumed by fear and manufactured insecurity. The flight attendant, a remarkably cheerful woman with a bright smile, approached my row holding a silver tray. "Would you care for a beverage before takeoff, Miss Preston?" she asked politely. I looked at the crystal flute of chilled champagne resting on the tray. "Yes, thank you," I said, taking the delicate glass. I rested my briefcase on the adjacent empty seat, clicking the brass locks open to ensure my new employment contract was perfectly safe. The cabin doors were officially sealed, and the aircraft engines roared to life, a deep, powerful vibration that resonated through the floorboards. I leaned my head back against the soft headrest, taking a slow, celebratory sip of the crisp champagne. The cool liquid danced on my tongue, tasting entirely of absolute freedom. As the massive plane taxied slowly toward the active runway, I watched the sprawling city skyline shift and turn outside my window. The towering glass buildings of the financial district, the courthouse where I had reclaimed my life, the luxury condominium where I had enforced the ultimate boundary, they all looked incredibly small from this perspective. I was no longer a victim, trapped in a web of corporate deceit and marital betrayal. I was the architect of my own incredibly bright future. The aircraft accelerated rapidly down the long stretch of concrete, the immense force pressing me comfortably back into my seat. The wheels lifted smoothly off the ground, leaving the earth and all of its tethered complications far below. Just as the plane banked eastward into the vibrant morning sky, my cell phone vibrated sharply inside my tailored jacket pocket. I pulled the device out, glancing at the bright screen before switching it over to airplane mode. A breaking news alert from a premier legal publication glowed vividly against the dark background. The bold headline was impossible to ignore. Federal prosecutors announced that the criminal trial date for disgraced executive Lance Preston had been firmly set for September. The article snippet beneath the massive headline revealed the full extent of the charges against him. Due to the mountain of financial evidence provided by the audits, the federal judge had completely denied his request for leniency. He was officially facing a maximum sentence of up to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. I stared at the glowing screen for a long, quiet moment. I pictured Lance sitting in a cold concrete cell, entirely stripped of his tailored suits, his luxury vehicles, and his arrogant smirk. He had tried to bury me in debt and shame, but he had only succeeded in digging his own inescapable grave. I locked the screen of my phone, the display fading to black, and slipped the device back into my pocket. The seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead as the aircraft climbed higher through the clouds, charting a direct, unhindered course toward New York. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my champagne. The chapter was officially closed. 6 months passed with the rapid, exhilarating pace of a life finally lived on my own terms. The transition from the suffocating corporate culture of my past to the dynamic, demanding world of New York finance had been entirely seamless. I stood near the expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my corner office, holding a warm cup of coffee. The morning sunlight poured into the spacious room, reflecting off the polished marble floors and illuminating the modern art pieces I had carefully selected. Looking out over the towering, iconic Manhattan skyline, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I was no longer the shrinking, anxious woman desperately trying to prove her worth to a husband who constantly undermined her, or a boss who refused to recognize her talent. I was thriving. My colleagues respected my sharp, uncompromising approach to forensic auditing, and my clients requested me by name. I was entirely self-made, having rebuilt my shattered reality into an empire of my own design. I had finally taken complete control of my life, embracing the incredible power that comes with trusting my own undeniable instincts. I turned away from the breathtaking city view and walked back to my large oak desk. Setting my coffee down, I tapped the trackpad of my laptop to wake the screen. A new message chimed softly in my inbox. It was a brief email from Harrison Caldwell, who still checked in on me from time to time. The subject line simply read, "Final Updates." I clicked open the message, my eyes scanning the concise, formal paragraphs. The federal court had officially concluded its proceedings yesterday afternoon. The mountain of irrefutable financial evidence I had provided made any defense completely impossible. Lance had been found guilty on all counts of severe corporate fraud, embezzlement, and trafficking stolen property. The judge showed absolutely no leniency, sentencing him to the maximum penalty of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. His assets remained permanently seized to pay back the shareholders he had deceived. The email continued with details about the collateral damage of his arrogance. Barbara had been completely destroyed by the financial fallout. In a desperate, futile attempt to cover his mounting legal debts and exorbitant attorney fees, she had been forced to liquidate everything she owned. She had sold her massive, pristine suburban mansion at a significant loss. Her country club friends completely abandoned her the moment the scandal hit the local news. Harrison noted that she was now living in a small, cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, entirely isolated and consumed by the bitter reality of her new life. There was also a brief mention of Brittany. When Lance's accounts were initially frozen and the luxury penthouse was seized, she had immediately vanished. True to her opportunistic nature, she had quickly attempted to attach herself to another wealthy older executive in the technology sector. However, the corporate world was incredibly small, and reputations traveled fast. The moment her new target learned of her direct involvement in Lance's highly publicized embezzlement scandal, he dropped her immediately. She was entirely blacklisted from the elite social circles she had sacrificed everything to infiltrate, left with absolutely nothing to show for her calculated deception. I finished reading the email and took a slow, deep breath. A wave of profound closure washed over me. I did not feel a vindictive thrill, but rather a quiet, solid satisfaction. The universe had balanced the scales perfectly. I reached out and gently closed my laptop, the screen fading to black. Opening the top drawer of my desk, I retrieved a small velvet box. Inside rested my late mother's diamond ring, the beautiful heirloom Brittany had surrendered outside the courthouse under the watchful eye of a police officer. I slipped the cold, heavy platinum band onto my finger. It fit perfectly, a constant grounding reminder of my true worth and the enduring strength of the women who came before me. A soft, polite knock sounded at my office door. My assistant peeked in, smiling warmly. "The executive board is ready for you in the main conference room, senior partner," she announced. "Thank you," I replied, my voice carrying the unwavering authority I had finally claimed as my own. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, walked confidently out of my corner office, and headed down the long corridor to lead the meeting. It was the ultimate satisfying payoff of total independence, unmatched success, and sweet, perfect justice. Whitney's story is much more than a tale of financial retribution. It is a masterclass in reclaiming your self-worth and enforcing absolute boundaries. For years, she allowed herself to be diminished by a narcissistic husband and an enabling mother-in-law, accepting a fabricated reality where she was always treated as second best. However, the moment she uncovered Lance's ultimate betrayal, she did not react with blind, chaotic anger. She reacted with cold, analytical precision. The greatest takeaway here is that true power does not require you to raise your voice or seek petty, vindictive revenge. Real power lies in the unwavering truth. Whitney used her intellect, her professional expertise, and undeniable facts to dismantle an empire built on lies. She proved that when you finally stop shrinking yourself to accommodate toxic, manipulative people, their fragile worlds will inevitably collapse under the weight of their own deceit. Leaving behind Lance's expensive, meaningless gifts perfectly symbolized her detachment from a life where her value was simply bought and paid for. True karma rarely requires you to get your hands dirty. It only requires you to step into your own light and relentlessly thrive. Lance, Barbara, and Brittany engineered their own devastating downfalls through their sheer greed and arrogance. Whitney's sweetest payoff was not just watching them face justice. It was standing in her Manhattan corner office, entirely self-made, knowing she built her new life on a foundation of unshakable independence.
Have you ever had to draw a hard line and completely rebuild your life after someone severely underestimated your worth? How did you find the courage to take back your power? Share your own stories of triumph, boundaries, and resilience in the comments below. If Whitney's journey to absolute freedom resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more empowering stories of sweet justice and self